Good morning, and thank you for welcoming me to this colloquium. My name is Olivia Macdonald Major. My presentation is titled Avenue of Escape or Program of Assimilation, the Paradox of Sports Participation in Indian Residential Schools. I'd like to start with a brief example. This picture is of the Amos, Quebec Schools hockey team. Such images typify a variety of the contradictory aspects of sports participation within residential schools. For instance, as Taylor McKee and Janice Forsyth explain in the article Witnessing Painful Pasts, while the Euro-Canadian public saw students lined up in neat rows, dressed in uniforms, with proper equipment, staring intently at the camera, which fostered ideas about belonging, health, friendships, social networks, and economic well-being, the reality of life within the schools is very different. Many of these images were staged for public distribution, sometimes hiding injuries and evidence of abuse with strategic body placement and new rented equipment and uniforms that were otherwise not utilized. This goes to the heart of sports' paradoxical relationship within residential schools. This paradox has two components: the experience of sports participation by Indigenous students in the schools and the intent of the federal and church officials. On the one hand, sports participation enabled students to escape abusive situations within residential schools. As Noelle Star-Blanket, a former student from the Capella, Saskatchewan school, describes, I was quite athletic, and basically that's what kept me alive. That's what kept me going with sports. This is typical of the testimony of many survivors who participated in sport. Students sought out sport because it allowed variation from their daily routine of Christian education and manual labor. It created the prospect of larger food portions, favorable treatment from school officials, and excursions from the schools from games. And importantly, for those who are being physically or sexually abused in the schools, sport created an escape route. Further, it allowed students to maintain and rebuild Indigenous identity. Students played and often beat teams from settler communities and public schools. The popularity of lacrosse at the Regina School at the turn of the century was linked to commonalities of the Mohawk game Tuarathon. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's final report explains that students utilized recreation as a tool to help them maintain, rather than lose, their Aboriginal identity. Moreover, it allowed students to achieve individual and team success within Euro-Canadian society. Some of the best examples of this are from the Duck Lake and Capella, Saskatchewan hockey teams in the 1940s and 50s. They achieved success at the local league and provincial levels over multiple years. The success of the Capella hockey team transferred to other sports at the school, such as baseball, basketball, and track and field, in part due to the coaching of former student Arthur Obey. However, the federal integration policy ended the success of the sports programs at the school. Lastly, it enabled students to build self-esteem and confidence. Within a system that otherwise promoted Indigenous subordination to Euro-Canadian culture through dehumanizing and traumatic treatment, sports participation was a rare instance in which students were able to build self-esteem, pride, and confidence in their own abilities. Such activities created an outlet for students to achieve external validation and commendation. On the other hand, sports participation allowed schools to showcase students as the achievement of the Canadian colonizing program and assimilation policy. As the TRC explains, recreation and organized sports were introduced in the hopes that they would contribute to civilizing residential school students. There are many components to this policy. First, the promotion of residential school athletes and teams nationally and internationally. As Indian Affairs Deputy Minister Hugh Keenlyside stated in 1948, one of the most useful steps that could be taken in this field of Indigenous sports and recreation would be the development of one or more Indian athletes that could win championships in Canada or represent Canada in games abroad. This policy translated to the promotion of specific athletes and teams as part of Canada's assimilation success story. For example, Shirley and Sharon Firth from Grolier Hall in Inuvik would go from winning local championships in cross-country skiing to representing Canada in 4 different Olympic Games and winning a combined 48 Canadian championships. Fred Saskamoose, one of the players in the 1949 Duck Lake Provincial Championship team, was the first status Indian to play in the National Hockey League, playing 11 games with the Chicago Blackhawks in the 1953-1954 season. Such successes were celebrated in Euro-Canadian media without reciprocal coverage of the harms of residential school systems. This assimilation policy was so important that church and federal officials argued over credit for the success of the sports teams. For example, church officials were excluded from a celebratory trip to Ottawa with the Sioux Lookout hockey team after their win from the 1950 Canadian Amateur Hockey Association Bantam Championship, as well as road trips and a team photo shoot. In return, church officials directed the principal to refuse to enroll the hockey team in the local league unless the team clearly represented the school rather than the local Indian agent. As the TRC explains, hockey was about more than sport. It was about promoting the success of the church. Second, the policy promoted Euro-Canadian sports activities and athletic ideals. Games such as cricket were introduced to instill British values of manly Christianity. Popular sports such as baseball from the United States and the modified Canadian games of lacrosse and ice hockey instilled Western ideals. School officials believed that contact through sport with Euro-Canadian settler population would have indirect educational benefits for Indigenous students through the transfer of dominant Euro-Canadian cultural ideals. The intent of uniforms and stringent grooming routines was to force young Indigenous students to look indistinguishable from their middle-class urban Euro-Canadian counterparts. As well, students were taught to idolize prominent Canadian athletes through exposure to major league sports on television, radio, and in print media, specifically on CBC's Hockey Night in Canada. Through media, Indigenous students were taught to idolize such athletes as Maurice Richard, Gordie Howe, Jean Beliveau, and Tim Horton, and patterned their actions and uniforms after these figures. Third, the policy promoted the exclusion of Indigenous recreation. As the 1895 report regarding the Middle Church Manitoba School explains, the manly games of cricket and football, introduced and practiced by the principal, have done much to take the sneak out of the boys. Recreation activities such as military drills, calisthenics, gymnastics, and organized sports were utilized as conversion techniques in the belief that they would aid the transition of residential school students into emancipated citizens. Lastly, the distribution and publicity of images of successful Indigenous athletes by Euro-Canadian media contributed to furthering the colonizing policies of the church and federal government. Such images portrayed scenes of victory and other achievements, promoting the narrative of the successful assimilation of Indigenous peoples to the Canadian public. These photographs, published in contemporary Euro-Canadian print media or dominating modern archival records, work to shape Canadian public's understanding of residential schools and Indigenous settler relations. This leads to the paradoxical relationship between the reality for Indigenous students and the intent of the federal officials and church officials. For students, sports participation was a mechanism for escape for the Indigenous students trapped within this abusive and oppressive system. As well, sports allowed individual athletes and teams increased freedom from the school environment and the ability to achieve external success and build self-esteem. For federal and church officials, sports participation was utilized to further their assimilation and civilizing agendas, promoting Indigenous sports successes to the national and international public through Euro-Canadian media as the achievement of the Canadian colonizing process. Part of this assimilation process entailed the promotion of Euro-Canadian sports activities and athletic ideals among Indigenous students, often to the exclusion of traditional Indigenous recreation. And while these divergent perceptions of sports participation are contradictory, the reality of the residential school system allowed these opposing truths to exist concurrently. While in reality, students gained a variety of positive effects from sports participation. In many instances, it was in an effort to contradict the assimilative effect of the school. The intent of government and church officials was not to provide the students greater freedom and privileges, but to further their assimilative and colonizing program. This research has left me with one major outstanding question. Can sport be a medium for healing and recreation and reconciliation for Indigenous communities? Multiple survivors, such as Theodore Fontaine and Harold Cook, testified to the TRC regarding the healing power of sport in their post-school years. A few days after I submitted my research, this article, First Nations Voices, Canada's Game, by Melissa Martin, was published on the Winnipeg Free Press website, discussing the indigenization of hometown hockey NHL and Hockey Night in Canada with the support of APTN and Sports Net TV networks. This article discusses the creation of Hometown Hockey in Cree, a national broadcast which spotlights hockey with Indigenous commentary and spotlights Indigenous cultural practices in various First Nations communities. As well, it discusses the diversified audience and a greater acceptance of Indigenous culture by Hockey Night in Canada, as illustrated by Ron McLean's broadcast from Peguis First Nation on March 1st, 2020. These initiatives allow for greater promotion of Indigenous language in Canada and cultural renewal within Indigenous communities, while at the same time allowing an avenue for healing for former residential school students, access to sport for Indigenous youth, and increased public awareness of cultural variation within Canada. So I'm left wondering if Indigenous sport media can become one vehicle through which Indigenous societies can regain their linguistic and cultural cohesion. Thank you.
All right, thank you for your presentation. I think everybody's mic has been unmuted. So, oh, that's not true. There we go. I think everybody's mic is unmuted now. All right, is there any questions?
Caitlin?
Yeah, great presentation. I really enjoyed it, and it's a really interesting topic. My question is, I know you mentioned that Indigenous participation in sports was a sort of a mechanism of escape, achieving success, and building self-esteem. But in your research, were there any students who sort of resisted or tried to refuse participation in Euro-Canadian sports because of this sort of portrayal as the sports as a colonizing mission?
Not that I found, because a lot of the testimony was through the TRC. So it's survivors coming forward and talking about it. I don't know if there's been specific research into this field, specifically looking at talking to students to see if there was any pushback. I think that the majority of the testimony has been students saying they wanted to get outside, they wanted to get out of the dorms, they wanted to get away from the church officials. It was a way to get away from the school. It was a way to gain freedom and liberty. And it was predominantly for many, many years angled towards the male population. And so when it was geared towards women, starting in the 50s and more in the 60s, it was taken on to a much greater extent in those years.
Thanks so much.
Any other questions?
Nick has his hand up.
Yeah.
I just wanted to echo what Caitlin had said. I thought your presentation and your topic is just fantastic. And from my understanding of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, tackling that as a primary source, there's got to be like a tremendous amount of information there to work with. Did you find that with your project, there's, in addition to that, any other supplementary primary sources that you're leaning into, or is that kind of the big one?
Right. There was a couple of very good articles, but there was also some memoirs.
Okay.
That had some small discussions of how they sought sport as like a way to escape, and how they saw it as this aspect of freedom. They didn't talk about it specifically as a colonizing aspect, but as this escape aspect. There are discussions in some articles, some more modern articles about sport, especially talking about these international athletes that have gone to like the Olympics and have gone on to the NHL. There's a lot of discussion in newspapers and stuff like that, so you can research that side of that. So it's not all the TRC. It was quite diversified, but the TRC is a massive amount of the information.
Okay, thanks.
I have a question. Olivia, I was really struck by the quote about the manly games and taking the sneak out of the boys. I haven't heard that term before, the sneak. You know, as I mentioned to you after the fact, there's a whole literature out there about the use of sport, organized sport in the British Empire to instill certain forms of masculinity. And really it's a militaristic masculinity. I'm just wondering if you came across anything about this, that when they say manliness, they really mean it.
It's the whole first, there's a chapter in the TRC on sport in the first volume. It's volume 1 of the like 19, I forget the years, the origins to 1939 of the TRC. And the whole first chapter discusses this manly Christianity and this need to, that's where the quote is from, this take the sneak out of the boys, and how there was this pushback from the students to want to engage in their own sort of Indigenous traditions and Indigenous recreation, to hunt and to play games that they recognized from home, but that the school officials were trying to instill things like lacrosse or cricket or westernized games, to instill these Western ideals rather than allow them these games that they understood from home.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, is there any other questions? Yes, go ahead.
Thank you for your presentation, Olivia. It was really interesting. I was just looking at the TRC's calls to action, and I noticed that, you know, so I teach in archival studies, and of course the archives and museums, so archives and museums together, have 4 calls, and there are 5 calls related to sports and recreation. So I don't know if you could just speak a little bit to whether you see the calls actually being fulfilled by the current government. How is you know, with the promise of fulfilling all the 94 calls and so on, how do you see that playing out within sports and recreation today?
I think that I'm not sure if the government necessarily is fulfilling them so much as it's more of a community-based effort to fulfill some of the calls to action, such as this promotion of sport and greater linguistic renewal in communities through this hometown hockey in Cree effort through APTN. It's not a government effort. It's more of a community effort that's being driven by a group of Indigenous people that went to Sportsnet and said, you know, this is something that the community would like, and it will make business sense for you because this is a large viewership. And rather than necessarily the government coming in and saying that this is something that needs to be mandated, It's more of a community-based project. I think that in general the calls to action are being fulfilled slowly. I don't think that it's going at lightning speed. But hopefully with this more of a grassroots, if you can call it that, effort, with this partnership with businesses and communities, that it will eventually get there. Hopefully it will increase as Indigenous languages and community strength will, cohesion within the communities will grow. But I don't know if the current government really has that mandate. So.
Are there any other questions? Yes, Dr. Goldberg.
Just a quick one. I thought in your presentation there was a picture of in one of the hockey teams had a young fellow in a referee's sweater. Was that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Did I see that? That to me is a really fascinating thing too, because it speaks, I think, about kind of external authorities imposed upon the game and kind of training at least one of these young guys to be an official, not a player. So, what does that say about, kind of this mission to westernize or to, allow certain levels of authority within the residential school for these kids, but not to, expand it beyond certain very limited bounds.
Yeah, I guess when I saw that, I was wondering whether or not they could get a referee from other places, from other parts of the community, and they had to train one of their own kids in order to be a referee so that they could have a referee. That's how I saw it. I don't know if that's a skewed version, but it could be because of the regionalization of the schools, that they just didn't have a person from one of the other communities to come in. But it could also help for because they were traveling with the teams, to have a referee that was part of the traveling group. I'm not.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the logistics.
I haven't
either.
done the. Yeah.
Power is always in there somewhere. You can be sure.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Are there any other questions? Okay, it doesn't look like it. So I would like to thank Olivia for your presentation.